Hi everyone, so today we're going to start our new unit. We're going to move on to chapter 7, which is on percents, and then we'll come back to chapter 6, which is rates and proportions. But I figured since we did some percents in our rational numbers unit, it would be good to get this out of the way now while percents are still fresh in your mind. So let's start by first talking about what a percent is. So percents literally means out of 100. So 73% means 73 out of 100, and so on and so forth. So when you're doing operations with percents, it's important that you know how to go from a percent to a decimal. So we're going to practice that today. Percents to decimals, and then we'll also do fractions. Okay, so let's just, for convenience, let's draw a table, and we will just fill this in together. We'll just do some examples. So we'll have percents, fractions, decimal, and fractions. Okay. And your table, obviously, as you can see as mine from an example, does not need to be very pretty. Okay, so let's say that I gave you to start 43%. So when I convert a percent to a decimal, if there's no decimal already in the percent, I pretend that there's one at the end, and I move my decimal in twice. So I would get 0.43. Or the math way of thinking about it is, since it means out of 100, this means 43 out of 100. And if I were to divide this, it would be moved in twice, and I would get 0.43 as my answer. So since this means out of 100, to write my fraction, I can literally just write 43 out of 100. So going like this is pretty straightforward, especially since these aren't reduced at all, so it makes it pretty easy. Okay, let's say that, let's do another example. Let's do 123%. So again, it's not going to be 0.123 as my answer. To get it to a decimal, I'm going to start at the end, and I'm going to divide it by 100, which means I move my decimal in 2 places, and I would get 1.23. And then, which makes sense because this is over 100%, so it makes sense then that here I'd have 1 point something. And so then when I go to a fraction, this just again means out of 100, so 123 out of 100. Okay, let's do kind of a harder one. Let's say I gave you a fraction that was 1/4. And I said, convert 1/4 into a decimal and a percent. Well, since percent means out of 100, the easiest thing to do would be to convert this to out of 100. 4 goes into 100 25 times. 1 times 25 is 25. And this is a review of 6th grade, so if you were to be given a fraction like this, they're all going to be easy to get to out of 100. They're not going to be like the 7th grade ones of like 1/8 and so on and so forth. It'll be pretty easy, like 1/4, 3/5, 6/10, things like that. Okay, so now since I know I have 25 hundredths, I know that that's going to be 25%. And I know how to get from here to here, and this would become 0.25. Because again, I'd start at the end and I'd move it in twice. Okay, let's start now with a decimal. Let's say it's 0.04. So let's first get this to a percent. So when I go from a percent to a decimal, I start here and I move it in twice, which means I would do the exact opposite to get it to a percent. So I would start with the decimal and I would move it back twice, and I would get 4%. You can also think if I divided it by 100, I'm going to multiply by 100. 4% means 4 out of 100. And if I wanted to reduce this, depending on the kind of problem, I could reduce this to 2 out of 50. Okay, so now that we've gone through this, let's now do some other examples, specifically with multiplication. So let's do multiplication. And creating equivalent expressions. So let's say that you were given something like 42% of 64. And you were asked, and you were given like a list of all these different expressions, and you were asked which one's equivalent to this. So first thing that we need to know is the word of in a problem always means multiply. So what this says is 42% times 64. So there's a couple different ways that I could rewrite this. Let's first start by writing this as a decimal. Of means multiply times 64. So if I wanted to rewrite this using decimals, this is what it would look like. I could also rewrite it using fractions. So 42% means 42 out of 100 times 64. And then 42 out of 100, that fraction could be reduced in half. So 21/50 times 64. So these are all the different ways that I could represent this problem here. I could also do 42% times 64, but that's kind of implied right here. So these are all the different ways that I could rewrite this expression to create equivalent ones. Let's do another one. Let's do 75% times 126. Okay, so let's start first by rewriting it with a decimal. So we have 0.75, because again, I start at the end if there's no decimal in my percent, and I move it in twice, times 126. I can rewrite this as a fraction, 75 out of 100 times 126. And then I can also reduce this fraction. So both of these are divisible by 25, which makes this 3/4. So these are all the different ways to create an equivalent expression to 75% times 126. Okay, let's do 2 more. Let's do 3% of 27. And obviously all these we could solve. We don't need to do that today. We'll do that tomorrow. So first thing is I can convert this to a decimal and rewrite it. It's not 0.3, that would be 30%. I have to move it in twice. Since it ends up here and I moved it in twice, I'd have to add a 0, which gives me the 0.03 times 27. 3% is also 3/100. 3 is not a factor of 100, so that's the simplest version. Okay, last one. 67% times 89. So I'm going to convert this to a decimal. And then I can also write it as a fraction. And the reason that it's important to know how to rewrite these is because I can't, depending on my calculator, most likely you don't have a calculator that can operate with percents. I can't just tell my calculator 42% of 64. I need to know how to get it into a way that I can use multiplication. Maybe I also don't like decimals. Maybe I prefer to work with fractions, especially if you understand dividing by powers of 10. You would know when I divide by 10, it just moves my answer in twice. And so maybe you prefer to use fractions. 3/4 is often a really easy fraction to do operations with. So it's important to know all the different ways that we can create these kind of problems, so that when we're solving them, especially if we do not have access to a calculator, we can solve them in the way that creates most success for us.